and I am here with a good friend of mine to talk about a topic that really matters today, namely, how do we talk about Jesus with the next generation? So if you're a parent, if you're a grandparent, if you work with kids in any capacity, this is a conversation you're not going to want to miss, because we're going to get down and dirty in the weeds, so to speak, and talk about real practical ways to do this in the home. But first, if you're new to the channel, make sure you push the subscribe button, because there's some videos coming up, including I will be responding to a skeptic who critiqued my argument from the death of the apostles to the resurrection. We have interviews with people like Stephen Meyer and Os Guinness coming up. You will not want to miss this channel in partnership with Biola Apologetics. Well, I'm here with my friend and my guest, Natasha Crain. Those of you watching live or later will recognize her. She's a very popular blogger, has written 3 books, including her latest book, which is Talking with Your Kids About Jesus. Natasha, amidst the craziness going on that we're all in right now, thanks for coming on the show and talking about this.
Hey, thanks for having me, Sean. It's good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you too. It's my pleasure. Well, let's jump in. And by the way, we're going to be taking some live questions. If there's questions that relate to the topic and I can throw them in there for Natasha to address, or even for me, I would be happy to talk about those in the midst of our conversation. But Natasha, let's start first with your story, because I remember hearing you speak at CIA with Frank Turk a few years ago, and you talked about just being a mom, raising your kids, wanting to blog and bless people with how to parent. And then all of a sudden, this barrage of really atheists and skeptics throwing questions you were not prepared for. And that made you think, if I'm not ready, how possibly could kids be ready with this? So tell us your venture into becoming not only an author, but really an apologist that focuses on helping kids learn about Jesus and truth in the home.
Yeah, well, that was a pretty good summary of what happened, actually. But just to give a little bit more context for it, back in 2011, I decided to start a blog. I had 3 kids who were 3 and under at the time. And really, it wasn't because I thought I had any expertise in parenting, obviously, with young kids like that. It was just that I wanted to build some connections with other Christian parents online. It was kind of hard to get out of the house with little kids at that age. And I thought, you know what, we'll just talk about on the blog things like what we're doing to help our young kids to know and love the Lord, things about devotions and songs and stuff like that. And so I started blogging just simple kinds of stuff. And my blog took off a bit. People started sharing it online with their friends. And like you said, suddenly I had this barrage of skeptics, and I wasn't writing anything provocative. So it's not like I was looking to engage with this stuff. I would have had no idea how to answer these things. I grew up in a Christian family, had been a Christian all my life. But as people started challenging me and just coming by and dropping off comments like, hey, there's no evidence for God's existence, right? And, Jesus never existed as a person in history, and the Bible's filled with errors and contradictions, all these kinds of challenges that you hear a lot about with apologetics today, they just were new to me. I really had no idea. And I realized that my kids were just going to encounter totally different stuff than I had encountered in my life. And I didn't know how to answer them. And so I just set off to learn everything that I could. That's when I discovered apologetics time. And I just loved reading and learning and seeing how much truth there was that I could grasp and feel confident about in my faith. And it just had never been on my radar. But as I started learning, I then turned around and made my blog a place where I could then equip other Christian parents with the same knowledge. So I was able to say, hey, this is the kind of stuff your kids are going to hear today. And here's what you need to understand about it. Here's what you can tell your kids, and here's how we can respond. And eventually that's what led to me writing the books that I did as my blog grew through that. And a lot of people started coming and saying, yeah, I had no idea about this stuff. And that's what really made my blog grow.
Now, you have told me in the past that you found like dozens and dozens of books and read everything you could get your hands on. You had time, the ability to manage your schedule that way. But I can imagine there's some parents or grandparents or youth pastors watching this going, I don't have the time. And I actually get that. I'm a professor, so I can kind of find and make the time. That's my job. But one thing I encourage to parents to do, and I wonder if you'd add anything to this, I'd say find some good podcasts you can listen to. That's how you learn. Frank Turk has a good podcast. William Lane Craig has one. I host the Think Biblically podcast. Just get one book, read one book at a time. What are some other practical things busy parents can do if they don't have as much time maybe as you had or have to learn how to defend all this stuff if they're afraid what their kids might ask them in terms of tough questions?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I think, first of all, I would say I actually didn't have a lot of time. So I wouldn't
Okay.
want anyone to hear my story and think, like, oh, yeah, she was just sitting around and could read all these books. That definitely wasn't the case. So I hope you'll find it inspirational. No, I absolutely did not have the time. But because I felt the sense of urgency and motivation, I wanted to make the time. And so I think that's important, and how I try to encourage parents in my writing and speaking is just to help them understand the deep need for this so that they do have the sense of urgency. But with that said, what do you do once you have the sense of urgency and you want to make the time? I think the most important thing is to figure out what fits into your patterns of life. So, like
Good.
you said, Sean, with a podcast, for example, maybe you take in stuff better while listening or while you're driving after you drop the kids. Whatever the case may be, find ways that really fit into your life and also fit your learning style. I don't learn well from listening.
Okay.
I don't get it from listening as much as I do from reading. And so for me, it was books. And I found that getting electronic books onto my Kindle helped me a lot to take
Mm,
books everywhere. So I'd be in the grocery line at the
smart.
store and long line. Okay, I'm going to pick up my phone. I'm going to read on my Kindle app and I'll pick up another few pages of this book. Or even I remember drying my hair in the morning and still I'm going to spend a few minutes there. I mean, you don't have big chunks of time a lot of times as a parent. And so you set aside some of the time for the more in depth resources, maybe that you're reading. And then the ones that are a little more straightforward, do that in the grocery line or while you're drying hair, or those little things that you do. So just find things that work for you learning wise and also that fit into those little nooks and crannies in your life.
That's great. And the important thing is not to compare yourself with anybody else, but maybe just
Yeah.
start and simply say, how do I take one step forward? What's one podcast? What's
Right.
one book? What's one blog? And you just get better. That's all we can do. By the way, we have people, Joe Hobbit, cool name, by the way. I've been to Hobbiton in New Zealand. Colin, or commenting all the way from Ontario, Canada, appreciates both of our ministries. Thank you for saying that. And Jody Green giving some love to your books, Natasha. So you are much appreciated. Well, let me ask
Thank
you this
you.
question. You were really kind of confronted as a parent with some of these tough questions and hadn't thought about it before. Now you did our Biola Apologetics certificate. You have read tons of books. You're now a national speaker on this. How has this shaped your confidence in the Christian faith? Have you realized there's more questions than before? Are you more confident? Like how does that shape your personal faith, having studied this so in-depthly?
Right. Well, it's interesting because I think a lot of times people find apologetics because they have questions and maybe they're lacking confidence, so they go looking for answers. I wasn't really in that position. So it was interesting to me because I had just kind of accepted my faith as it was, having always been a Christian. So I didn't know what I didn't know, really.
Mm,
And so once I started looking for answers to the questions that I was receiving, actually, it made me a little bit more nervous. And that was a good thing for me
okay.
because I
Okay.
realized these are not questions I've thought about. And what is all this about evolution? This is not something that I've ever studied, and it really should. And I talk about this actually in my first book to learn about the evidence for evolution and how does all this fit together. So I'd say that when I very first started looking for these answers and started reading about other perspectives for the first time, it made me a little bit nervous and uncomfortable because I just hadn't seen that before. But then as I continued to pursue the answers, and that's the important part here, as I continued to pursue the truth, that's when it became clear to me just how much evidence there is for the truth of the Christian worldview. And then I gained a confidence that I didn't even know I needed to have.
Mm,
So it was kind of an interesting outcome for me because I was just kind of a Christian by default in a lot of ways, but now I'm a Christian with a different level of conviction that I didn't even realize was possible. So I think that also is a good reason for parents to think about for their kids to learn apologetics, because maybe their kids are kind of on autopilot right now and they're not
mm.
questioning, they're not doubting, and you might find kind of comfort in that. But at the same time, eventually they will encounter the kinds of challenges like I did. And if they don't go all the way in continuing to pursue truth for whatever reason, they might end up kind of thinking, gosh, this is bad. This does make me nervous. And by the way, I might walk away from my faith. So I just think it's an example of that.
There's some research out of Fuller Theological Seminary that says it's not doubt that wrecks a kid's faith. It's unexpressed doubt. So I can imagine there's a lot of parents watching this going, I'm not Sean McDowell, I'm not Natasha Crain, I'm not whoever, fill in the blank with, say, their favorite Canadian apologist, somebody like, say, Tim Barnett. They're not that apologist. So they're afraid to talk about these questions with their kids. But what the research shows is if kids can express those doubts and we can talk about them and go find an answer together, that helps a kid's faith flourish. So just beginning this conversation is a win, so to speak, even if we don't have the answers. Now let's jump in to some practical things to really help out parents here. And one of them is, actually, let me ask you this first. Tell us about your family, as much as obviously you're comfortable, because I want to know, what are your qualifications to talk about being a parent? And I say that with some jest, but share about your family before we get into some of the specifics you do as a family to teach apologetics.
Yeah, well, I've been married for 20 years, 20.5 years, if you want to be specific. And my husband is the chief operating officer of the Orange County Rescue Mission. So he works with the homeless population in a transitional living facility. And actually, if you're interested in the issue of homelessness, he was the live stream guest on Frank Turek's show this week. So you can check that out, that he was on there talking about homelessness during this crisis. But we have 3 kids, and they are 11-year-old twins. They're in 5th grade, and a 9-year-old also. So my qualifications for talking about parenting is that I've been in the trenches for all of 11 years. There are lots of parents who've been in the trenches a lot longer than that. But it's really more, I always tell people, I don't write books and I don't speak because I'm any kind of parenting expert, but I'm here to talk about my journey into apologetics and why this is so important, and to help equip parents with the understanding so that they can transfer that knowledge to their kids.
By the way, sometimes there's an assumption that people who are, say, really hurting for financial need that would go to a rescue mission wouldn't care about apologetics. But you and Brian invited me to come share at Truth at the Orange County Rescue Mission. And I went up to the Urban Rescue Mission LA. Both times spoke and taught on apologetics and had some of the best conversations I've had. So in your family, you're modeling truth in apologetics, but relationships and love, which I think is the biblical model. So let me ask you this question. Sometimes I find that people put kids in my Bible class. I not only teach Bible, but part-time in high school. And they'll say to me, hey, I'm sure glad you can teach my kids truth. That's why in their class. And in my mind, I always think it's really not my job. I'm happy to write books. I'm happy to blog, happy to do a podcast, happy to teach a class. But you argue that it really begins at home. Tell me why you believe that biblically. And then I want to ask how we can get into what that looks like in your home.
Yeah, well, I think it starts with, what does the Bible tell us about discipleship? And the Bible doesn't explicitly talk about passing on our faith a whole lot, but when it does talk about passing on faith, it talks about doing it when we sit down, when we walk along the road, when we lie down, when we get up. In other words, it's all the time. It's a way of life. It is very proactive. And I know some parents I've heard in the last few years from have come along and said, yeah, but I'm just letting go and letting God. This is God's hands. And I have no doubt that they think that that's a very spiritual answer, or even biblically sound, because they think that they're being humble enough to say, well, I know that, ultimately this is God. But the Bible actually calls us to be extremely proactive in discipleship and how we're doing this and making it a way of life. God could have come along and said, hey, Israelites, you leave it to me in order to talk to the next generation, to reveal myself directly every time. And that could have been consistent with his character and what he wanted to do, but he didn't do that. And I think that's the point, that he was calling us for a very active involvement. So that's the first thing, is just understanding discipleship, that we are the primary spiritual influencers in the lives of our kids. So some parents would say, yeah, I get that, but apologetics is kind of different. It's this different subject. And so, yeah, I want to send my kids to Sean McDowell's class. And to that, I would say, I think it's a misunderstanding, really, of what apologetics is and the role of that in raising our kids in the faith. So what I always try to encourage parents to think of this as, it's a way of teaching your kids about the faith. So it's something that should be integrated from the very beginning of how we talk with our kids about Jesus. And I think you can see this especially if you think about the nature of the claims that we're talking about. Okay. When what we believe as Christians is extremely extraordinary. We're talking about a man 2,000 years ago coming back to life from the dead, and we're saying that he's God and that we're going to revolve our whole lives around him. These are extraordinary claims. And if we were claiming anything this extraordinary in today's world, I saw something crazy happen or a pig flew over, we would assume we have to explain, sure, here's why there's good reason to believe this. So in the same way, I think a lot of times, especially if you're a lifelong Christian, you forget how extraordinary our faith is, and we just teach our kids kids the what of being Christians without thinking about, but hey, why should I believe this? And so what I like to encourage parents to do is to just think of this from the very beginning when your kids are little and you're teaching them about Jesus. It's not just here's what we believe, but it's here's why we have such good reason to believe it. It's not an extracurricular subject. It's not something that you send your kids away to learn about later. It's something that should go hand in hand with teaching them worldview.
I love to hear you say the importance of why. I was speaking at a weekend conference about 8 or 10 months ago when you actually could speak publicly at events. And it
Way
was
back
all
then.
right, it was all weekend with my dad on sexuality. And a 13-year-old came up to me and his mom was there. He said, "Thank you for not only telling me what the Bible says, but why. I've been told pornography is bad, but nobody explained to me why." That kid is not going to have any depth of conviction to live this out until he not only knows what the Bible says, but why it says it. So I love hearing you say that. Let me ask you this. What are one of the truths that you think parents maybe fail sometimes or forget sometimes to teach their kids about Jesus? So in your book, you talk about 30 conversations we must have. I want to know, what's one of the conversations that we often don't have, or maybe we do have in a way that we shouldn't, that communicates something to kids, something about Jesus that maybe is either not biblical or just not the message we ultimately intend to give them?
Yeah, well, I think that a lot of times parents feel most comfortable talking with their kids about subjects related to Jesus's teachings. So, it comes a lot more naturally for them to say, well, Jesus says we should love others. And, Jesus says this about our behavior. And Jesus says we should do this. And so I think that passing on the teachings is quite easy for most parents. But I think that jumps over a really important question, which is the identity of Jesus. How do we know that Jesus was who he said he was? So the first section of my book really sets this up, and that's the focus. It's on the identity of Jesus, with several chapters on, did Jesus exist, and was he the Jewish Messiah? Is Jesus God? How do we know Jesus performed miracles? All these questions related to his identity. And I think that's so important because a lot of times we forget when we're talking about the teachings of Jesus that, maybe our kids don't necessarily care. Maybe they're not so sold on the authority of this Jesus that we're talking
Okay.
about. Because if we haven't convinced them that Jesus was who he said he was, then they're not going to care any more than what their next door neighbor is saying. So it's important that we don't just go straight to teachings, but we talk about the identity of Jesus. And that's why I start the book in that way.
Okay, so one of the ways that Christians often teach to kids is say, here's the story of Ananias and Sapphira, don't lie. Actually, that's probably a bad example. Probably most parents and pastors don't even talk about that story, which is a point within itself. But every story has some moralistic, don't lie, tell the truth, be honest, stand up for right, as if the Bible is a book about moral behavior alone. How do we teach a Jesus to our kids that's much bigger than that, that's grounded in relationship with God and relationship with other people? How do we avoid falling into that moralistic trap?
Yeah, that is such a good question. That's actually something that I have been thinking about a lot this week in particular, because during another interview that I was doing, we got a live question from someone who was asking how they can better apply Bible verses to discipline issues. And
Wow.
I thought about this a bit because I know it's actually a fairly popular approach. Books written
Hmm.
about this. If your child's with anger, then read these 5 verses, or it's all very tied together. But I actually think that if we rely on our discipline in this way to just tie Bible verses, and it can lead to resentment, I think, of our
I
kids
agree.
in terms of their faith. Because if most of the time what they're hearing is, okay, I was bad and here's what the Bible has to say about it, then they start to form this negative association that the Bible's only relevant for their behavior at any given time. And that can lead to resentment of God, thinking of him as what, a lot of skeptics tend to think of him as this big guy in the sky who has all these rules for us and is just waiting for us to mess up. And so, I absolutely believe that the Bible applies to behavior, but I think that the timing of that matters a lot, that's something that in the moment, maybe you just have discipline without the Bible verses, but then later you can always have those conversations about, well, why do we even care about how we act in this way? And why would this even matter in terms of our faith? bigger, broader question there is just how do we present Christianity as a whole worldview and not just about the discipline? And I think this is what I lacked so much growing up. I spent hundreds of hours in church and I had a loving, wonderful Christian home, but I had no idea how I would
Hmm.
actually see the world differently because of my faith. And it really wasn't until the last few years of studying apologetics that I started to make those connections of just how different life should look depending on what you believe about the nature of reality. And so I spent a lot of time with my kids just talking about the different worldviews that there are and what are the logical implications of each one. Okay, if you don't believe that God exists, here are some of the things that naturally, logically come along with that. Questions about that we would have to have free will, for example, or for there to actually be an objective moral standard, and helping our kids just to understand that's what that worldview entails and looks like. Here's what Christianity entails and looks like, so that they have an appreciation for it as an entire way of seeing the world and reality, rather than just, hey, this is about God looking over my shoulder and here's the Bible verse that goes with it.
That balance is really helpful. One of, I think, the best things or lines my father ever came up with is rules without relationships leads to rebellion. Rules
Mm.
without relationships leads to rebellion, or truth without relationships leads to resentment. And that's really the balance. So my parents didn't do this. I don't do this with my kids. Honestly, well, the Bible says and it's wrong. It makes the Bible a book of discipline they associate with negativity
Yeah.
rather than something life-giving and positive that's a blessing and experienced relationally. Well, I want you to tell me practically, what does this look like in your home? What are the conversations you have? What lessons do you have? Walk us through practically how you do this with your own kids. And by the way, before you jump in, we have people commenting from the UK. We have people commenting all the way from a few places in Canada and even as far as Missouri. So we're glad you are all with us. So go ahead and lay out practically what this looks like in your home, Natasha.
Hello, Missouri. That's awesome. Hello to everyone out there. Yeah, it's a great question because I think sometimes all this sounds like it's very theoretical, but we have to talk about, okay, bring it down to what happens in the day to day. So our lives with the kids are quite busy. They go to a private Christian school. For right now, I'm actually going to start homeschooling in the fall for my twins for middle school, which I'm super excited about. So things will look different then, but
Wow.
I'll just kind of address things as they are right now. But so most of the time in the evenings when you would have the biggest chunk of time to spend with your kids, I have to say that we are either at a baseball field or a soccer field most nights of the week. And so that takes away, unfortunately, and this is just the reality of the situation, from some of those core family times that we're experiencing now during this lockdown. So I think like a lot of families, it starts to make you question, what are we doing and how much time are we spending on these things? And that's something that we all have to deal with. But in an average day in the pre-coronavirus world, I would say that there are probably 4 touch points or key times where we would have conversations
Okay.
about things.
Okay.
There's on the way to school, on the way back from
Okay.
school, at dinner time, and at bedtime. So on the way to school, we have a 10-minute drive. So there's only so much that can happen. And sometimes that 10-minute drive is filled with bickering and it's filled with angst about school or whatever the case may be. But there are other times when I'll take prayer requests from the kids and just say, hey, is there something I can pray for you about today? Or somebody in the car will read something. The kids have their Bibles in the seats in front of them. And so they can pull it out and somebody can read something and we can have a little discussion about it. Does that always happen? Absolutely not. Does that happen sometimes and lead to some meaningful conversations that are short? Yes, it does. So having the Bibles in the car like that just makes for those opportunities to do some of those conversations on the way to school. Nothing super deep. On the way back from school, I make it a point to ask my kids about what they did at recess and lunch specifically. And this is something I don't remember where I heard this, but somebody at some point in my life gave me this advice, and it was great advice because if you just say, "How was your day?" you're going to get very little from most kids, depending on your kid, I guess. And if you ask, "How was class?" you're going to get the same kinds of things. But when you ask them about their social times, that's when you start to hear about those relationships and the kinds of conversations that have come up. We have had great conversations on the way home just about what happened between kids at school. And it can lead to a lot of these things that you might think, well, how could you possibly talk about that? My son's told me that a kid in this class that he doesn't think that, and this is a Christian school, he doesn't think that God made the solar system, for example.
Okay.
Oh, that was an interesting comment that you heard today.
That's great.
Well, how did you respond? So ask your kids about those free times. And I think that you get a lot from that. And also, I have to say, because my kids go to a Christian school, sometimes they'll bring up things that they learned about in Bible, and that's natural, but that's not going
Sure.
to apply, I know, for everyone. And then, so we usually head off to the various activities that we have, but then we come to dinner time, and our family does highlights around the dinner table. So, what was the highlight of your
That's
day?
great. That's
And this
great.
is helpful for our conversations because it's kind of like, what was a high point? And then sometimes we'll do low points also, just to kind of see where everyone is. But you never know what comes out of those high points. And it's interesting because sometimes what I'll use as a high point, something related to what I'm doing with my writing or speaking, I'll pull in something I saw for the day. And maybe it's an article that I read, or maybe it's a social media post, but I'll use that as a chance to bring up a conversation where we can talk about it and say, hey, this was a high point. I, talked to this person and we had this conversation. What do you guys think about this? And so it's a really good time to just bring it in to that conversation. And then the last time would be at night when we're getting ready for bed. I
Okay.
am absolutely worthless after 7 o'clock at night. I have never been a night person. I mean, my wall hits after dinner, the calories settle in, I'm done. So this is not my strong point, but this is where it helps to be a team because my husband can stay up forever and he's
There you
great at
go.
that, even when he's dog tired. So he takes up the slack at that point from me, just, falling asleep. And he does a devotional with the kids at night. So either he'll read a chapter of the Bible or he'll do some kind of devotional as they're in bed and
Mm,
stands out in the hallway and does it.
love
And
it.
sometimes that leads to questions right there at night. Sometimes they're like, oh, we don't want to hear the devotional. That's the reality of the situation. They're kids. Doesn't mean that we're not going to do it. So that's kind of the rhythm of the weekdays. On the weekends, we do our best every week to do a family Bible study.
Okay.
And as much as I think that devotionals can
Hey,
be
can I
helpful,
can I can I
especially,
jump in here for a second? Let me come back
yeah,
to the weekend and unpack your week first and see what this looks
yeah.
like. First off, you said it's a matter of teamwork for you guys. I love that. Being on the same page is absolutely vital. By the way, we see some hellos from people in Bogota, Colombia. My friend Ken in Tulsa. If you're enjoying this conversation, give us a little thumbs up. It helps spread the word on the algorithm in YouTube so more people can get some practical training. If you have questions, send them in here and we're going to take them. I see one that just came in from Dustin. I'll come right back to that question. But it sounds like what you're saying is kind of an opportunity kind of parenting. And our mutual friend Jay Warner Wallace and I wrote a separate book. And the purpose of this book was to say, here's not a new program that you do with your kids. Let's more efficiently use the time that we have to teach them spiritual truth within that time. And it sounds like that's what you're saying. Did I get that correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I kind of label it in terms of creating moments and using moments.
Okay.
And so for me, using moments is kind of what I guess people would call a teachable moment. Things come up and it's an opportunity
Perfect.
to jump on it and have that kind of conversation. So, on the way home from school or at dinner time, those are often the teachable moments. Creating moments to me is more when you're taking the time to say, okay, we're going to have that devotional tonight. Right
Gotcha.
before bed. We're going to make that moment happen. That's not something that just naturally came up during the day, like some of these other conversations, but it's something that we're setting aside. So I think that is
Okay.
the kind of the model for what we try to do is to make sure we're taking advantage of all the moments that we can, but also making sure that we don't just rely on those moments because you're never going to find enough teachable moments to teach your kids everything that you need. That's why we have to create the moments too.
Gotcha. We're going to come back to those creative ones that you do on the weekend, but this is something I do with my kids. If I'm reading the news, if I'm watching a YouTube channel, if I hear a story, I will bring it up at dinner and oftentimes just ask my kids, I'll be like, hey, this happened in politics or this coronavirus hit. Why do you think God allows this? And I just ask them and try to create a conversation rather than me lecturing at them. So let me go to this question from Dustin. He says, as a children's pastor here in Oklahoma, what's your opinion on reducing or expanding upon these conversations on Sundays, Wednesdays with my church kids versus Bible stories or Bible drills?
Is that for me or for you?
That is for you.
Oh, okay. All
And then
right, I
I'll
got
weigh
it.
in.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and I think that it's not like I was talking about earlier with integrating the what we believe with why we should believe it. I think that a lot of times if we just start talking about apologetics and we're only talking about these things, that doesn't necessarily mean that our kids have a thorough and accurate understanding of Christianity itself. And so those things have to go hand in hand. So when we talk about Bible stories, well, our kids need to understand the Bible, and unfortunately, there's a lot of illiteracy today with the Bible itself. And so it is still very important that when the kids are at church and when for youth pastors and for Sunday school teachers that we are making sure that kids accurately understand what's being taught, because there's so much misconstruing that happens today. But alongside that can easily fit together these conversations of the why. So if this week you're talking about the miracles of Jesus, for example, maybe you're talking about feeding the 5,000, well, that's a great opportunity to talk about that particular account in the Bible, but also to go the next step and say, by the way, what exactly is a miracle? And
Good.
talk about the definition of a
Good.
miracle. And hey, why do we think miracles are even possible? How does that relate to evidence for God's existence? Why do we think, historically speaking, that there's any reason to believe that these happen? So these things can go hand
Okay.
in hand. It's not one or the other.
Okay. So, Natasha, pretend I'm 8 years old or 10 years old. And I go, yeah, how do miracles happen? Like when I put a quarter on the water, it sinks. And you're telling me Jesus walks? It's kind of hard to understand and read the Bible. That stuff doesn't happen. How would you explain that? Your best. And I didn't prep you with this question. I'm throwing it at you
It's all right.
to an 8 or 10 year old, because that's really where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. So pretend I'm 8. This is your chance, Natasha, to talk down to me. Pretend I'm 8 and explain the possibility of miracles to me as best you can.
Yeah, well, I would tell 8-year-old you that it's really, first of all, a great question. And it's really important that we understand what a miracle is before we can understand why we should believe that they happen. And I would probably at that point have a little diagram to say, okay, what is a miracle? And in the talks that I do, this is how I explain it to adults, but it would be the same for kids. If we show the world like this is our natural world, this is our universe. Well, a miracle would be something extraordinary, something way different than the ordinary happening that has a supernatural cause. In other words, something outside of the universe caused that to happen. So I'd show the circle and then something outside of the universe, something supernatural, and explaining that means beyond the world. And I have
Okay.
little arrows that point down into it. So you can
Okay.
just see visually speaking, this is what a miracle is. And then I encourage kids to understand, hey, if nothing exists outside of the natural world, outside of our universe, if nothing's out there, there's no God, there's no nothing, then can a miracle happen? And the answer is no. If God doesn't exist, then miracles aren't possible. We should be able to agree with our atheist friends on that. But if something does exist out there beyond nature, then can miracles happen? Could that supernatural being actually do something? Well, sure, he could. That doesn't mean that he does all the time, but he could. And so I teach kids, if God exists, miracles are possible. And if God doesn't exist, then miracles are not possible. And that's the starting point for that. Now, of course, then we would have to have these conversations about, well, how do I know God exists, right?
There you
But
go.
after we have those conversations
Sure.
about the evidence, then we can talk about, okay, that leads to these other conversations about Jesus and, was Jesus God and the resurrection? I mean, all these conversation pieces fit together, but I think definitions are so important as a starting point, because once a kid understands, okay, that's what a miracle is. It's not, oh, mom found a parking spot right next to the store. It's something about a supernatural being intervening in the world. Then we start to say, yeah, you're right. The quarter naturally speaking can't go on the water and walk on the water by itself. But if Jesus was God and God exists, then these things become possible. So that's just a
Hey,
starting point.
you converted 8-year-old me. Nice job. But it sounds like a couple things. Number one, this isn't like a one-time answer and move on. You raise
Yeah.
questions and talk with kids, given their attention span, given their interest, and you move on and keep looking for those opportunities. But each question raises other questions. And the hope is, and this is my hope with my kids, that we talk about this stuff in 5, 10, 20, 30 years, just as my dad and I still talk about and debate and discuss these things. I'll have that relationship with my kids. So it sounds like this is the beginning of a lifelong conversation, helping kids in age appropriate ways think about these biblical ideas. Now, in your book, one of the things you do, you've written 3 books. This is your third. is you've kind of thought through the most common questions Christians ask, especially young people. And what I found is when I work with young people and really anybody, there's just certain questions that come up 90% of the time. Rarely are there really new questions. So in your 3 books, you've tackled probably, and 90% plus of the big questions kids are going to ask, but then give really practical graphs and illustrations and ways that kids go, that connects with my mind. Isn't that your goal of what you're doing in your other books, and in particular, talking with your kids about Jesus, is that parents have a way of using a hook or an illustration or a metaphor that connects with the young kid's mind? Is that right? Explain to us exactly what the goal is of what you're aiming to accomplish in this.
Yeah, so a few things. First is for parents to understand what those big questions are today. So sometimes parents just haven't encountered them before. And I realized this the first time when I had a blog post that went viral. It was my first one in the whole apologetics area that people started really looking at. And it was called 65 Apologetics Questions That Every Christian Parent Needs to Learn to Answer.
Cool.
And there were no answers given. No answers given. It was 65 questions. And it was kind of my collection of, gosh, these are all the things that I have been hearing, that I've been investigating. And it went viral. Thousands of people were sharing this, and it still gets shared all the time today. And I thought, wow, this is crazy. People need to know the questions just to start with, because they don't necessarily encounter them in the same way that their kids will. So that's kind of my first goal, is that parents understand the questions being asked today.
Good.
The second one is that they have a succinct answer that's easy to understand. So most of the chapters are about 5 pages, and they're just, obviously can go much deeper in all these. I give lots of end notes and point to lots of books, great books like Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And I point people there and say, hey, for more, go to this book. This is a great resource. But it's a jumping off point so parents can get that. But I also learned after my first book, Keeping Your Kids on God's Side, that a lot of parents feel like, okay, after I read the chapter, how do I actually pull this out of my head and into conversation with my kids? And based on that feedback, I added a little bit to the format of my next 2, Talking with Your Kids About God and Talking with Your Kids About Jesus, so that every chapter has a conversation guide. So
That's
every
great.
chapter, after you read your 4 to 5 pages, maybe 6 pages at the most, then you have key points. So you can quickly go back to it and refresh your memory later. If you're like, wait, how do I know Jesus is God? You can go back and get 4 or 5 basic points. And then the conversation guide goes from an easy, open the conversation kind of question, just to get kids talking or thinking or giving their opinion about something. And then it gets progressively deeper into the conversation that you can go with as your kids get older, revisit the book and go a little bit deeper with them. And then for the older kids, tweens and teens, there is something called Apply the Conversation at the end there that has an actual quote. And I spent a lot of time when I was writing the book digging for these, that has an actual quote from a skeptic that I found in a book or online that challenges whatever they learned in that chapter. So it gives them an opportunity, after you've had these conversations, to go back and say, okay, here's how I would reply to a real life person who made this kind of comment. So those are some of the things that I do. And all the chapters have illustrations in them as well that parents can use in talking with their kids.
By the way, when I saw your books, your first one, my instant thought was, why didn't I write this? And I mean that as a compliment, because I thought, I've written books like you mentioned, Evidence Demands Verdict and others. And some people read that, and it's important to. But what you're doing is saying, here's a practical way to just use this today with my kids. And we need that as well. So it's the kind of resource someone could take right now, especially in the midst of the quarantine, and start practically having these conversations with their kids. Now, I notice you also teach, and this is something that I try to do with my kids. When I role played the 8-year-old, you said to me, you explained a miracle because that's what I asked. But I also know earlier that you are pretending to ask a lot of questions. So for me, when kids ask me questions, like my son asked me, who is Jesus praying to in the garden? Because if Jesus is God and the Father's God, was he praying to himself? I almost always ask questions back because I want to know, why is a kid troubled about this? What does a kid understand? How much do they want to know the answer? Can I have a conversation and then gather that information first? So kids can Google answers today. But to me, I want to help my kids not only have the facts about Jesus, but learn, how do you think theologically? How do we come to answers? It sounds like you had discussion guides and conversation questions to ask parents. Parents can ask their kids in the end of the book. But how do you do this with your own kids? Do you ask questions? Do you explain? Is it both? Tell me what that looks like in your family.
Yeah, I think it depends on the question that they're asking, but that's such a good point about making sure to ask them questions back to kind of get their understanding. And because a lot of times we assume that they understand things that they don't. And an example that always comes to mind for me on this topic about engaging with kids on these questions is my daughter when she was little. I think she was probably about 5, and I had been reading lots about miracles as I was kind of getting through all this apologetics material
Yeah,
that I was reading. And she had learned about, miracle of the 5,000, had talked about it in church, and so I was all ready to have this great conversation with her about, okay, well, what is a miracle? Funny that, we're talking about miracles again here. And it was so funny because when I asked her, she said, well, I guess Jesus just split the 5,000, the bread into 5,000 pieces. And it was just this funny moment because we might be thinking we're about to teach them something else, but they're on this totally different wavelength. And it's not just young kids that happens with. I
sure.
mean, I see this happen over and over as my kids get older. I give the example in one of the chapters on if Jesus is God, how could he die? And how my daughter one day had said that that God died on the cross. And so I kind of had to have this whole thought process of, well, did God die on the cross? Well, Jesus is God, but if we say God died, what does this mean exactly? And
It's a
so
great
asking
conversation.
those asking those questions back of, well, why, what would be the difference to you if it was God that died on the cross, or if we say Jesus, what do you think that difference would be? Those are really helpful questions because it helps kids to process it and to
Good.
exhibit that critical thinking. But I think it's funny because you kind of mentioned, to gauge their interest, and that's such a big point too, because sometimes when kids will, ask a question, it might not be something that they want to go super deep in. Maybe this is an area you have dug into and you're so excited because you just read a giant book about science and religion, and your kid asks some small question and then you start going crazy. They don't want to hear it all. And I've had to learn this the hard way from my kids, to the
Mm,
point that sometimes it's even gotten
that's
to,
good.
here comes mommy. Here goes mommy again, a long answer. And so I really learned from that mistake because it made me think, okay, I need to gauge how deep we need to go right now. And so we actually kind of have a joke about it in our family of, hey, I don't want you to be discouraged to ask questions because you're going to get mommy's long version. So we will actually give the kids a choice.
I
Okay, do
love
you
it.
want the
I love it.
15-word answer? Do you want the 30-second answer or the 1-minute answer? And of course, we can always go deeper after the 1 minute, but
Sure.
it's to gauge what they want. And so sometimes just for fun, they'll say, the 15-word. And we've had this happen over dinner, for example. And so Brian and I, my husband and I will, sit there and we'll try to come up with the best 15-word answer. And it becomes something fun. It's something that, brings some life to the conversation and it isn't so technical. And so, yeah, I think the gauging interest is a really interesting point, and it's something that I've struggled with and had to come to the other side of really understanding, okay, here's where they are at this time. I don't want to discourage them from asking questions in
That's
the future because here comes the answer train.
that's really helpful and practical. We have a question from Grant that I'm going to throw at you in a minute. But as you're talking out loud, one of the things I might start using on the kids, I might say, do you want a Twitter answer, which there's limited characters? Do you want a TikTok answer where there's 1 minute, a little longer? Or do you want the full answer, maybe Facebook answer, where people go on, and give them those categories? I think I'm going to use that to gauge their interest in a question moving forward. One thing that I try to do with my kids when they ask a question is I also want to know, is this a question of the mind or is this a question of the heart? Because those are very, very different questions. Sometimes the kids ask a theological question, but they're hurting or they're confused or they're worried or they're anxious. And how we answer that is very different than a question that just interested a kid for whatever reason they got interested in a theological question. So I always prayerfully try to gauge what's the heart of this question and address it accordingly. Let's go to Grant, though. So this is for you, Natasha. He says, not a parent, but I'm curious. I'm trying to have one meaningful conversation each day. That means FaceTiming friends. Is there a good question that either of you use to initiate faith conversations? So let's do this. Why don't you, Natasha, talk about how you initiate faith conversations with your kids, question you use. Then I'll talk about one maybe with a non-Christian.
Yeah, well, a lot of times, like I said, this comes up with these teachable moments when they say something about what their friend said. And if you're not really being mindful of these things, then you could just, it goes in one ear and out the other, and you don't say anything about it. But I think that what we were just talking about is so helpful, that you ask them a question back related to whatever it is that they're actually, thinking about. But when it's more of a proactive type of conversation where I'm wanting to get them to talk about something, it's like you were saying, Sean, bringing something to the table and saying, "Hey, I just read this article that was written by an atheist, and here are some things that he said. What do you think about that?" So it's really, in terms of getting them to open up, I think that it's helpful to have those kinds of conversation starters rather than just a pointed question about where are you in your faith, or something
Good,
that's really,
good.
putting them in the hot seat, because then it's kind of like, well, let's focus our attention on this thing over here, and it allows them to think through things, but also for you to hear how they're thinking and to see where they are. Because as kids get older, as they enter those tween years, and of course in the teen years, they don't so much appreciate the direct, questions at them. So I think that it's really helpful to use other kinds of tools to talk a little bit more indirectly.
That's really helpful, Natasha. I appreciate that. Grant, here would be a thought that I would have. If you look at how Jesus talked with non believers, there wasn't just one spiritual question that he asked. He talked with, say, the rich young ruler differently than he did the woman at the well, differently than he dealt with the religious leaders, differently than he dealt with, and fill in the blank. Jesus used wisdom where somebody was at spiritually. And typically, he either asked a question or he shared a story. So one thing I've done during this time is non-believers in my life, I've sent them blogs that I've written. I've sent them articles that I've done and said, you know what, thinking about you during this time, if you have any spiritual openness, here's something I think might interest you. I'd love to talk about it with you if this is something that's interesting to you. And that gauges their interest. So I'll tell you, I have a good friend of mine that our guest next week that we're having on is Gene Robinson. And some of our audience may or may not know this, but coming up, it's been clouded by the coronavirus, but it is the 25th anniversary, for lack of a better term, from the Oklahoma City bombing. It's been 25 years. And a friend of mine, Gene Robinson, has written a book, and it's about the reconciliation of the father of Timothy McVeigh, who is the Oklahoma City bomber, and the father of one of the victims. And they have come together and reconciled their relationship because of their mutual faith in the Lord. When I read part of Jean's book and interviewed her for the Think Biblically podcast, I'm supposed to be this cool apologist, Natasha, and I was in tears because of this. So after we record that, I'm going to send that to a few non-believers and say, hey, I know you have an interest in history. I'm an apologist and there's a Christian angle here. But if you watch this and have any interest, I would love to talk to you about it. That's a very natural, non-threatening way to talk with somebody, yet also shows that you care. So you could use that one or any other thing that you've seen. I interviewed Lee Strobel last week at the Resurrection. Find another blog, find another piece, share it with somebody because people are hurting. Maybe it's a piece about anxiety. Maybe it's a piece about depression. If you're talking with someone they're anxious and say, you know what, can I just tell you how I deal with anxiety? And share Philippians 4:6 or talk about 1 John 4:18. That's a very natural, fair, loving way. And if the person is interested, you can have a spiritual conversation. So that's one way that I do. Let's get back to parenting, Natasha. And I do have a question for I mean to ask. And here's a question. How do you navigate giving kids good answers with admitting sometimes that we don't know or that well-meaning Christians disagree? Because I find that a lot of times my students from my class or high school students get to college and they find out, wait, Christians disagree about certain things. The age of the earth, role of women in the church, evolution. And they don't know how to process that disagreement. And so I want to make sure younger kids realize there's areas that we really are central, areas that are not. And it's okay to have questions without making a kid think, when they tend to be black and white, oh, so we don't even know that Jesus rose from the dead. Like, how do you find that balance with your own kids? And how did that shape the way that you wrote this book?
Yeah, I think that this comes up a lot in our house actually, because one of my kids is especially fascinated by this whole thing about, well, how old is the world? Well, why do Christians not know? How can we not know how old the Earth is? And I think that this it has also come up because my kids attend a Lutheran school, and we go to a non-denominational church. But at the Lutheran school, all of their friends were baptized when they were babies, who are also Lutherans, and we did not baptize our kids as babies because we believe in believers' baptism. And so
Okay.
they've had to encounter these things and ask these questions. And so one of the things I have found most helpful is to explain why. Going back to this question of why, explaining why Christians have different beliefs. And this is so important because I want my kids to know it's not just because we all just kind of have different opinions. We're all not just kind of like thinking, well, I think that we should do this and I think it's this. It actually goes back to some pretty sophisticated questions about how we read the Bible. And why would someone thoughtfully come to one conclusion and someone else would thoughtfully come to another when they both agree on the authority of the Bible? And so, actually, coming back to certain passages we looked at, for example, a few of the verses that people point to support infant baptism, and we talked about it from our perspective. And looking at that, I think, is a much healthier approach for kids to understand than just saying, oh, no, this is what we believe. It's helping them understand here are the views, here's accurately what people believe, and here's why they differ based on how they read.
Mm.
But like you said, I think there's such an important distinction there between, Christians of different denominations who will disagree on some of these things versus people who are of whole different religions. And I draw that distinction actually in a chapter in my first book, in Keeping Your Kids on God's Side, of just making sure kids understand there are some boundaries around what we can legitimately call the historic Christian faith. And this comes up a lot today when we talk about progressive Christianity also, which
Mm.
I address a lot in talking with your kids about Jesus, of just how far can you
Important.
go of saying, well, this is essential or this is not essential. And so we spent time talking about, okay, the historic Christian faith, here is what is so central. First and foremost, I want my kids to know 1 Corinthians 15:14, if Christ has not been raised, then your faith is useless. It's in vain. It doesn't matter. We don't need to be Christians or care about Jesus if he was not raised from the dead. And so we've talked a lot about that around this Easter, that this is the truth test for Christianity. And so just expanding out from there, okay, well, what else have historically Christians
Great.
agreed upon in terms of that? And so I think that's helpful. Go back to the bedrock, look at the Bible specifically and point them to here's why people are disagreeing about this, and then go from there in terms of what other religions believe.
Natasha, what would you say to parents who are kind of afraid to go down this road because their kids might ask questions that they don't know the answer to? What encouragement would you give to them?
I think, I was going to, this sounds funny, but I was going to say it's great if you don't know the answer.
Hmm.
Obviously, we want to have some answers for our kids and we want to be able to answer their questions. We don't want to feel them to feel like, gosh, mom and dad have no clue. I'm thinking about things they've never thought of. But at the same time, when you don't know an answer yourself, it's such a perfect opportunity for you to come alongside your child and say, that's something that I've wondered about myself, or that's something that I've never really dug into, or, I should know the answer to that. And I don't know the best way to answer it, but there are a lot of really good ways to investigate our questions today beyond just going to Google. And here's what we can do together. And so I think that that's really important for our kids to understand. And in fact, even if you know the answer, maybe there is a lot of room for you to say, I want to work on finding the answer with you. And let's find that answer
Yeah.
together. And you can kind of help them process that. Because if you're always the Q&A machine, come to mom and dad and we'll give you the answer that you're supposed to have, then kids don't learn how to find that themselves,
Mm.
because they are just going to go to Google. And if you Google something like, did Jesus exist? You're going to get a whole lot of really interesting answers, and it might not be the way that you want your kids to learn to process things. And that's not to say we just want them to process things in one way. We want to show them, okay, well, here is how you would research to find out what one person believes and why they believe it. And here is where you would go to find out a Christian response and everything in between. So we want to teach kids those skills, because ultimately the internet is this vast,
It
vast
is.
land of just, I don't know what you would call it, but it's a vast land. And we want we want our kids to be able to go and actually find legitimate, well-researched answers.
Natasha, you know that my dad had a really rough childhood growing up. His dad was a town drunk. My dad's older sister took her life. My dad was really severely abused by someone who worked on their farm until he was old enough to slam against a wall and say, if you touch me again, I'll kill you. My dad ended up becoming a believer. And one of the things he's built into me in my life, he goes, son, there's setback, there's pain, there's hurt in life, but we got to choose to see that as an opportunity for the kingdom. So I think some reasons parents might fear starting this conversation is the pain of feeling inadequate as a parent. And I get that. I feel like I fail all the time as a parent, Natasha. I do. Even though I write books on this and talk about it, I feel like I fail. But I also realize, okay, it's when I fail and things don't go as I want to. And if my kid asks a good question and here's Mr. PhD doesn't have an answer, you know what? Let's go find this together. And that's a relational opportunity that I think you're talking about. Now, let me ask this about your book, because I do want people to get your book. I think it's wonderful. I think it's practical. I hope they'll go out there and pick up a copy of it. But even if people don't, can you share with me an example of somebody who's read this book or one of your other ones and came back to you and said, hey, here's how I practically put this into use? And I want to hear it because I want the wisdom of practical using it, whether someone gets your book or not. Again, I hope they do. Tell me an example of somebody contacted you about how they practically put it into use.
Yeah, well, for whatever reason, it comes to mind that I've heard from quite a few moms who were wishing that their husbands had taken more of a leadership role in their home
Hmm.
in terms of leading Bible study or leading devotionals. But for whatever reason, dad, he is a Christian, but wasn't really taking on that role. And the mom had picked up the book, and dad saw it and kind of picked it up, started thumbing through it. And then the dad ended up reading the book and found it really interesting and thought this was something that we could do as a family. And so I've actually heard from several moms in that exact situation
Okay.
who now are just thrilled because their husband is doing a devotional around these topics and found it
I love
really
it.
interesting. And it was something that they wanted to do. So I thought that was really interesting and encouraging. And one that comes to mind is a mom who had emailed me because her 15-year-old son had really started encountering a lot of skeptics at school. And they were starting to challenge a lot of things about what he believed. They knew he was a Christian. And he came home one day and was in tears and was like, I don't know how to answer them. And, how do I even know that God exists? Because it was really more of a, there's no evidence for God's existence type of challenge. And so the mom had heard about my books and she went and she got them. And so they started reading it together. And the son got so fired up about apologetics. He had never heard about it before that now he's reading all kinds of apologetics books and he wants to go and study apologetics eventually. And he has been able to go back and engage with his friends at
I love it.
school and feel confident doing it. So that to me was just a really great story because now to see that somebody has this passion for it, and it could have been any book. That's not to say, oh, it's just my book. It could be any book, but for a kid to see there are answers to this, there are
That's
answers
great.
to all these questions that I'm getting. I want to learn more and I want to share with others.
I love it. Two last questions for you. But first, a comment. We have a question from Haley. It says, where would you suggest going to research with your kids without Google? So I want you to address that, Natasha. But the first thing to do, Haley, is if your kid asks you a tough question, don't freak out. Again, view it as an opportunity. So my father very wisely had tried to think through every conceivable situation that us kids might do and how he would respond. If one of my sisters came and said, Dad, I'm pregnant. If I came to my dad and said, Dad, I'm gay. If I came to my dad and said, Dad, I don't want to go to college. Whatever it is that he wanted for us as kids, and we said the opposite. Or if I said, Dad, I'm an atheist, how he would respond so he wasn't caught off guard and could answer with kindness and wisdom in that moment that can really take us back. So don't freak out and try to think ahead of time of how we might respond so we can be gracious in that moment. But more specifically, outside of your 3 books, which is the first place I hope parents go, they'll find answers to God's existence, tough questions kids ask, and your most recent one about Jesus. But where else do you consider good sources to go?
Yeah, I think that it's really important to consider what the nature of the question is. And this is a really good thing for kids to understand. We don't just go into the black hole of Google, but let's figure out, okay, is this a question about how to interpret part of the Bible? Is this a question that a historian would answer? Who would be the person
Okay.
of expertise in order to answer this kind of question? So, for example, if you want to figure out, okay, how do we interpret this passage and why do people interpret it differently, then you would want to look toward a commentary or a study Bible. And some of those things you may or may not have on hand. A study Bible is always really helpful to have on hand, so you can have that. But if it's something that you want to go in depth with, you can find find all kinds, and this is where you can use Google, to use Google to find what are some of the best commentaries for certain things, but then use the commentaries to go into that. Or if it's a question of history, how do we know that Jesus actually existed from a historian's perspective? What does that look like? Then you're going to look for the historians that might write about this. And one of the best
That's
things
smart.
that I can say in terms of getting kids to think critically for the future is to help them think about, okay, everything I read is going to come from someone's perspective. They're going to have a worldview, and no matter what they're writing, they still have this perspective behind them. At least know what angle that they're coming from.
Love
And
it.
I learned this early on because when I was in my early 20s, I decided, I need to really understand my faith a little bit more. I went to the bookstore and I looked for the Christian section, because what could possibly go wrong in the Christian section?
Of course.
And I picked up a book by a very liberal Christian scholar, and I had no idea it was just about the historical Jesus. I thought, oh, this is going to be fascinating, and I talk about this in my new book. And when I picked it up and I brought it home, the subtitle, it was called Jesus: A Revolutionary Biography, and the subtitle was "A Startling Account about Jesus of Nazareth." I think I'm getting the words a little bit off there, but it was a startling account because the Jesus it presented was nothing like the Jesus that I had grown up knowing about, because it was a totally different perspective. He was a fellow of the Jesus Seminar. It was just a totally different perspective on everything. So I use that example
That's
to
great.
show, with my kids, I want them to understand when you go into a store and you see a Christian section, doesn't necessarily mean
That's
what you
great.
think it means. So know who the author is and what perspective they're coming from. Not to say you shouldn't read it.
Sure.
If you go on my
Yep.
website and you go to resources, you'll see that I recommend, over 50 books there. And one of them
Yep.
is The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. You should read other
Yep.
viewpoints, but you need to know where a person's coming from when you read it to know what kind of source that you're getting.
And by the way, parents and students, that's also true for Christian universities. The title Christian doesn't mean all universities are equal. That's why I love Biola, because we're committed to inerrancy, to life, to marriage, to the scriptures. Find out ahead of time. It doesn't mean don't go to another school, but know exactly what you're going to expect before you get there. By the way, people listening, if you have tough questions and they're apologetic related and you need a good book or resource and answer, I actually have a team at my website at seanmcdowell.org. If you send in an email through that, we will do our best to find an answer, even if that answer is read this book, check out this blog, and direct you to a trusted source. Last question for you. In your journey in a mom, finding these answers, you actually joined us in the apologetics department. We have what's called a certificate program. Could you briefly talk about why that was helpful to you and why you would suggest parents or youth pastors to at least begin there to learn how to know what they believe and why they believe it?
Yeah, well, so as I started my journey of figuring out, oh, wow, there are lots of questions that I don't know how to answer, I kind of approached it of just picking things off as I would encounter them, because I didn't know what the questions were that were out there, right? I would kind of see that this person is saying that the Bible's filled with errors and contradictions. Okay, let's go pick that one off and see what I can learn about it. Or, what is the evidence for God's existence? And so I was kind of picking here and there and reading a ton of stuff, but there had been no structure to what I was learning, because it was all very just natural from the bottom up of how
Sure.
I was, getting these objections. So it was really helpful to me when I discovered the certificate program, because I didn't know what I didn't know. And here was this great opportunity where I didn't have the time to actually go back and get a full master's degree, but it had the credibility of being developed by Biola with these world-class instructors who knew exactly the kind of material that someone would need to have if they're getting introduced to these things. And I loved that it just gave that structure and approach, so I could come to it and say, okay, I've been learning a lot on my own, but let's put a little bit of a shape around it and make sure that I'm really covering my bases on things that maybe I haven't heard before. And so it was super helpful to me from that perspective, and I really appreciated what the value of the knowledge that I got from it.
Well, we're really grateful for your ministry. Your new book, again, I'm going to commend to our viewers, Talking with Your Kids About Jesus. 30 conversations every Christian parent must have. And also follow Natasha's blog, which I do, at christianmomthoughts.com for really helpful, practical worldview resources. Thanks to all of you for listening in and for your comments. If you've enjoyed this, make sure you push the subscribe button, because we have some fascinating interviews coming up. There was a comment that said, only 8,000 subscribers and a few dozen people. Well, hang in there. This is our third live stream. We're really just starting to use this resource to reach people, and praying that God will bless it for the kingdom, because we need to bring Christian voices not only to our kids, but to the larger culture as well. Thanks for listening in, and God bless.